Okay, so it's year 12. You've been learning about ecosystems for a number of years now, but it's time to tweak that understanding. So you first learn about ecosystems as food chains in primary school. Organism A eats organism B, which eats organism C. As you go through middle school, you develop that a little bit further into understanding food webs and how different species occupy different positions on a food web that interrelates and leads back through the decomposes to a nutrient cycle within an ecosystem. Well, now we need to take it up another level and think about each of those nodes, those points on the food web, not just being a species, but a population that can grow and shrink and change in size. And also that ecosystems aren't sitting there all the time, always, that sometimes an ecosystem needs to start from scratch with just a few organisms in it, and then new ones arrive or evolve and add themselves into that ecosystem. So ecosystems are dynamic, changing systems where the points are not fixed in size or in number. And so ecosystems are complex interacting populations, which we call the community of living organisms, plants, animals, microorganisms, plus their natural habitat, the ground, the earth, the water. So an ecosystem is quite complex and changes over time. So let's start at the beginning and how an ecosystem forms. So before we have ecosystems, you just have bare rock. When new land forms, it's bare rock with no life on it. So it takes a long time to develop an ecosystem, hundreds of years. We call this process succession, and in particular we're going to start with primary succession. So here at the bare rock, no plants can grow because there's nowhere for them to put their roots and not much water or moisture. Lichen is a symbiotic organism that involves algae and a fungus living together that can live on bare rock and starts to break that down and make some sort of sand. Once there's something for seeds to take hold in, some small plants and lichens can continue to grow, and as they die, they leave their organic material behind that starts to turn that sand into soil. As you get more and more soil and the depth of that, bigger, larger plants can grow. So we're just looking at the plants here, but obviously not really a lot of animals and birds can get much out of this, but maybe some insects can. Here when you have the flowers, obviously you bring in a whole lot of insects, then you might have lizards that can eat the insects. And so as the plant life grows and the flora grows, then the fauna comes in as well. So birds, reptiles, mammals start to be part of this ecosystem as well. So we have a succession over time. You work towards what's called a climax community. When it's now peaked, it has a high level of biomass. The amount of living material there is obviously much more, but also a high amount of biodiversity. Lots of different species, each with their own genetic diversity. An example of this sort of happening is, for instance, after volcanic eruptions, you might have new land, new islands that form, and sometimes over some time, this rock has to break down to be some soil and some small plants start to grow. What also happens sometimes is what we might call secondary succession. And so often through fire or flood or some other natural disaster, you wipe out all of the fauna and flora in a particular area and have to start all over again. Now, it's not quite all over again because obviously with secondary succession, you already have a layer of soil and dirt there. And that means that the annual plants can come much faster. You don't have to wait for rock to break down to sand to soil. And so secondary succession is much faster. Often you will have the same plants re-established from that area, but you could also have very different plants and invasive species come in and start to grow, because once the climax community's been removed, there's now more light, different open landscape, new seeds can come in and find their place and start to grow and maybe outgrow the species that were there originally. And so here's an example of some species growing on the forest floor, or what would have been the forest floor before this fire came through. Now these wouldn't normally grow there because the canopy of those trees would mean that they wouldn't have enough light. But once that's burnt away, these can grow there. And so these might grow for the first few seasons, but then be replaced as the shrubs and trees grow up. There's not enough light down here anymore. And so these annual plants and grasses and perennials wouldn't grow on the forest floor once it's back to being a climax community again. So that's primary and secondary succession. And that's how ecosystems can form. now we look at the other side of things, ecosystems in decline and in decay. So we know that there are species that go extinct. So just as we have speciation, which is the balance of creation of new species, we also have extinction, which is when a species disappears. Now, often this happens because populations shrink and get smaller to the point where that population becomes very vulnerable. And being a small population is bad in two ways. One is that there aren't many individuals, and so by chance you could lose the last individuals of a species, but also it reduces the amount of genetic diversity. We see from the example here that when you have good genetic diversity, this female cheetah could mate with multiple males, and her cubs each have different characteristics, different sets of alleles, because there's a large gene pool. And if there is some sort of pathogen, a cold, that affects allele A, B and C are immune and they're fine because we have variety there. But if there's only one male for this female to mate with, perhaps there's a very low diversity amongst her cubs, and all of them carry this same allele which is vulnerable to the pathogen, and so the whole litter could die in that instance. And so when you have a large gene pool, you have variety, and that provides a protection against being genetically vulnerable. And what we often see is when the population size decreases, the genetic variation obviously decreases as well. And although the population could grow, all of these individuals are related to a small cluster here. And so there's not much genetic diversity. Genetic diversity, new alleles, and they're spreading throughout a population, takes longer than just increasing the numbers in that population. So when we have breeding programs in zoos, we're able to increase the number of individuals, but not so easily can we increase the genetic variation in the remaining endangered species, which is why zoos trade different pandas around the place so that they can breed with ones that are not closely related and increase the genetic diversity of pandas. Even worse than that background extinction, obviously, is the possibilities of mass extinctions. And so there have been mass extinctions in the last 540 million years, 5 big ones. Probably the one that is the most familiar one is happening around 65 million years ago, which was the one that led to the extinction of the dinosaur species. So this Cretaceous end of the Cretaceous here, 50% of animals families, including the last of the dinosaurs and many marine species, became extinct after a large meteorite hit in Mexico 65 million years ago. But there have been many other mass extinctions, some of them caused by meteorite impacts, others just by variations in climate change or large amounts of volcanic activity. But what we often see is that even though extinction reduces a number of species, a little bit like the burning in the forest, it allows new species that wouldn't have otherwise got a grasp in life and got that sunlight to expand and grow. And so often there's a proliferation of new species, and speciation happens after extinction. And that's perhaps some potential hope, because we are considered to be in the middle of the 6th great mass extinction happening at the moment. Human activity is leading to a whole lot of extinction on the planet, and we're very aware of this. So some of the things that are causing extinction of species by humans, a large amount of that is habitat alteration, clearing of forests and destruction of wilderness. Commercial hunting, including fishing, being a huge amount of that. Introduction of species, pest control, hunting for food by individuals, some of them being captured, some of them just being killed through superstition, and some of that being direct pollution. But we're also aware that indirect causes of pollution, such as carbon dioxide emissions causing climate change, are leading to habitat alteration. So these things often work with each other. So bad news being that the loss of biodiversity is going to have a huge effect on human populations. It's not just that we lose species, but each of these species are part of intricate, interrelated food webs, and so losing those disturbs that whole ecosystem. And ecosystems provide us with clean water and clean air and food and medicines and tourism and a whole lot of other different things that we rely on to keep human life happening on the planet. So extinctions and loss of biodiversity is a major challenge for your generation and the generations to come.